I conduct research related to traditional and new media, and in this study what we are interested in is documenting any sort of bias that might be happening in newspapers related to the availability of digital data and big data. Consumers often wonder what goes through an editor's mind when they look at newspapers. How do the news that they read, how do they make it to the newspaper or the TV that they watch? And they often wonder, are they selected based on some sort of particular agenda of the newspaper, or are they sorted based on their importance? Now, if you ask a journalist, up until recently at least, they would give you the answer that yes, news are selected based on their newsworthiness, their importance, and the novelty, how important they are, how new they are to the public. However, if this is the case, of course, consumers may also wonder, why is it that we see so many cat pictures, or why is it we see so many quizzes that are available on the news media? Now, we took an alternate approach to this. We had an alternate hypothesis, and we said, well, perhaps there are other concerns in editors' mind, especially these days when the editors are fed so much information about how the individual stories on online news articles are doing. In particular, we are thinking that there might be a relationship between the traffic that individual articles receive and how long stories, particular topics, are covered on a newspaper. So we tested this hypothesis using data from a large online version of a reputable newspaper outside of the United States. It was actually an Indian newspaper. And we wanted to see if the stories whose first articles received a high number of clicks for various reasons, if they somehow were covered for a longer period of time in the newspaper. And we also tested various additional measures of resources that an editor might allocate to this story. And what we found was interesting. We indeed found that there is a relationship between the number of clicks that are received by the article and the amount of time that a story is essentially covered by the follow-up articles that are repeating on multiple days. Those two are positively correlated. Well, there are a couple key takeaways from our research. First is, of course, this relationship that indeed, whenever a news article receives higher number of clicks, there is a higher level of resources, editorial resources that are allocated to the particular story. But this is, of course, something that makes sense at a correlational level. You would wonder, to what extent is this also causal, the relationship? What I mean by that is, to what extent is it the case that just because the news story is receiving higher number of clicks, you see a longer period of time that's allocated to it? So we had to establish this. This was the main effort that we exerted in our research. What we did was to find some instruments, as we call them, that would affect essentially the amount of clicks that are received by the article, but not necessarily the editorial decision of how much time to allocate to it. And the two instruments that we used were looking at rains, days with rains, and looking also at the ordinary power shortages. So our idea is that if there's a rainy day, people would be staying indoors, they would be more likely to go online. That is going to create some sort of a shock in the number of clicks. Similarly, on the days when there are ordinary power shortages, it's likely that the chances that people will go online is going to go down. That's going to reduce the number of clicks. Indeed, when we look at the relationship between clicks and these two instruments, we find a significant relationship. And whenever we looked at essentially the editorial policy related to these two instruments, we are also seeing that indeed there is a relationship that we can see in terms of how long the coverage of a particular story is, or also on how many follow-up articles appear related to a particular first story that was published. What would that mean? That might mean that if it happens to be a rainy day, or if it happens to be that in India, if there was an ordinary power shortage, on the day that a Kim Kardashian article first broke, that story actually may run for a couple more days on the newspaper as opposed to another story. Well, the conclusion that surprised us the most was probably once we started separating news into further classifications and made a comparison among them. So what we did as an addition was to analyze news as hard versus soft news. What I mean by hard news is the type of news that tend to provide more information to the consumers. For example, news related to politics or business. And by soft news, I mean news such as entertainment or sports. When we looked at whether traffic that's received by articles influenced the coverage of stories, by looking at only the hard news and the soft news, we found that the effect is present only for the hard news. It doesn't exist for the soft news, or to put it in more academic terms, the effect is not significant. So what this might imply is that consumers should not necessarily worry that just because now traffic information is provided to news editors, and news editors tend to pay more attention to them, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll start seeing newspapers full of cat pictures or more entertainment stories. In addition, we also found we quantified the effects of the traffic. So what we can say is, for example, increasing the news story clicks by about 700 clicks is going to result in about 3 additional days of coverage in the storage, and that might also mean 3 additional articles on average about the same story, about the same topic. So that's the second finding. So in terms of the news industry, right now there's a lack of consensus in terms of what the newspapers should be doing with all of this digital data. When we look at some newspapers, Vox.com is mentioned to be an example of this. They tend to recommend their journalists to stay away from digital data. This is done in order to encourage them to come up with better stories, newsworthy stories, stories that matter for the society. When we look at other examples, Gawker.com is mentioned to be an example of this. These newspapers tend to provide some sort of an incentive for their journalists to create stories that can bring higher number of clicks. Usually these incentives are in the form of financial payments. So there isn't really a consensus, and it's not clear exactly what policy should be the right policy to embrace by the news industry. Our study, I think, shows what can happen, or at least currently documenting what's happening in one large, reputable portion of the news industry. What we are telling the news editors is, in some sense, yes, it might help to use the digital data as long as you're not using this in order to dilute the quality of information that the consumers are receiving. And for the consumers, I think we are telling them that they don't have to necessarily worry about the quality of information that they receive from newspapers. Digital data might still actually help them. It can increase the number of stories that are informative in some sense, or the coverage of the stories that are informative. For policymakers, this brings up other questions because the one other side of essentially clicks driving your news is what happens to the representations of the minority views when the majority of clicks are received by the populations or the subgroups that are also in larger portions in the society? That might bring up some questions about viewpoint diversity, which is important from the perspective of FCC. And they might need to start now asking some questions about what does this policy do to the viewpoint of some of the minority, maybe groups in the society. Well, technically, our research is the first that's documenting the existence of bias that's coming from the traffic. So in that sense, we can't really make a comparison to former research, but we can say that we are providing an evidence of a bias that's in a different format. And that is essentially very new, just something that we are starting to see in newspapers as an additional form of traffic-sourced bias. Well, we are still conducting and carrying out further analysis to see if we can make additional statements about this type of research. And we are getting lots of feedback from our scholars and also peers in the industry. As far as following up with our research with the same research co-author, I'm going to be following now on social media, not just the traditional news media, and we are going to look at other impacts, other factors that might be influencing people's life. Now, one particular study we are focusing on that's relevant, but a very different topic, is looking at politicians' entry on social media and how that influences their chances of raising campaign donations.